R. Kuhn is professor and Jean Adamson Stanley Faculty Chair in Literacy at the Purdue University College of Education. Her primary focus has been on reading fluency and how best to support its development. In addition, her research interests include literacy instruction for struggling readers and comprehension and vocabulary development. Her instructional expertise includes clinic work, directing reading interventions, and teaching in the Boston Public Schools. Dr. Kuhn has 4 books and numerous journal articles and book chapters, including her co-authored book, Developing Fluent Readers, Teaching Fluency as a Foundational Skill. Now, Dr. Kuhn is also the moderator for the readingforum.com website. Melanie, welcome to Literacy Matters and Power Conversations.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited about doing this.
I've been following your work, and I love that we're talking about this. You know, when people think of the science of reading, unfortunately, all they think about oftentimes is phonics.
Yes.
We know that it's more than just phonics, right?
Right.
How would you define the role of fluency as part of the science of reading?
Oh, I think it's such a key to connect students from that point where they're learning to read. I don't want to say reading to learn, because I think we can pull all of the reading to learn pieces down to the younger kids. They're learning that content from the beginning now because of a lot of Neil Duke's work, but also it allows the students to get to the point where they're reading in ways that sound like language when they're reading aloud. Yeah. And when they're reading to themselves, they can hear themselves read, or at least most people hear themselves read. They have a nice voice in their head. And fluency is the piece that allows for that comprehension to take place, both because the word recognition becomes automatic as part of fluent learning or fluency instruction, and because the prosody piece, which is the expression and the appropriate phrasing, that is part of that fluency piece as well. And that allows for comprehension to develop in a unique way.
I love that. So when we think about fluency, right, what does it look like in actual practice? When you're thinking about teachers supporting students becoming more fluent readers, what does that look like?
There's lots and lots of work on fluency instruction. There's lots and lots of work that's been done on fluency instruction, and there's lots of approaches that are effective at helping students become fluent readers. I think most people are aware of the work that develops automaticity through repeated readings. And Tim Rosinski does a great job with the work on repeated readings, using poems, using speeches, using short passages. The thing that I think is particularly important about fluency development is that you can use longer text as well. So we know that you can use repeated readings. You can also use what we are calling wide reading. So rather than reading a particular passage or even a chapter short book multiple times, you can read multiple books, and you can get the same benefit if that reading is scaffolded. I think that's the key element. The teachers using echo reading, using choral reading, and possibly partner reading if it's doing a repeated readings, the students can develop that word recognition that's automatic. And because they're hearing a lot of oral reading from their teacher and receiving that scaffolding, their reading begins to start to sound like oral language. When you have first graders, sort of at the end of first grade, they're starting to develop that fluency. A lot of times, Jean Shell used to call it being glued to print. You hear the reading the pacing isn't very good. They'll read 2-word phrases, they'll read 3-word phrases, but they aren't very natural sounding.
Sure.
And as they develop over second grade with the right supports, that fluency starts sounding more and more the way their teacher would read, expressive and enjoyable.
So when you think about this, you mentioned echo reading, you mentioned possibly partner reading, maybe even choral reading.
Mhm.
What are some specific routines that teachers can put into place? Because when you think about, I mean, like when you think about all that teachers are doing, there's so much, right?
Oh, there
How do you
is.
fit all of that in? What kind of routines or strategies do they need to have that kind of fluency practice?
Well, we've had really good success with the research we've done using either multiple text or individual text multiple times
Mm,
over the course of the week. So if your goal for your second or third graders is to develop their fluency as a whole class approach with your shared reading text, we've had two different approaches that we found successful. The first used the literature anthology or the shared text that the teachers were wanting to use as their primary reading for a particular week.
mm,
What they did was the teachers would read the text aloud to the students, and the students would follow along, and then they discuss the text, and that would be their Monday lesson. On Tuesday, they would echo read that same text. On Wednesday, they would choral read the text. On Thursday, they'd partner read the text. And on Friday, they do their extension activities. The alternative, where we use multiple text, the teacher would read the text aloud on Monday, and the students would follow along and they do their comprehension activities. Any pre-teaching, all of those things happened on Monday.
sure.
On Tuesday, they echo read that text. On Wednesday, they'd have their extension activities. And on Thursday and Friday, they'd echo read a new text. Now, you think about resources and how difficult it is to come up with those texts. But luckily for us now, there are more resources that teachers can use. So you could use your science or your social studies text as that second and third text.
Mm,
Or you could use something like a weekly reader. Or if you're getting, I believe Scholastic has a magazine. Time has a magazine for kids. You could use those as your second and third readings. Or something off the internet. So something from NASA for kids. You could print out copies for your students. And I always like to say, if you go back to the storage closets, odds are you're going to find extra texts from previous years, and you can use those for your readings as well.
sure. So when you think about this whole repeated reading, some teachers might think, well, I've got students that are like, we read that already, or
Mhm.
I've heard this already. How do you keep it fresh and interesting, and keep kids engaged with repeated reading?
Well, interestingly enough, um, we worked for many years on this approach, and we had some teachers who got a bit tired of it, but the kids never really did. And I think the thing is, if you're using the same text multiple times, what happens is the kids see themselves getting better, and that's really motivating.
Yeah,
So a child who might stumble a little bit at the beginning of the week when you're doing the echo reading, by the time they're doing the partner reading and they know they can read the entire page by themselves and that they aren't having any difficulties anymore, that they feel like they're real readers. And
yeah,
that tends to be very motivating for them. We also found that there was a real comfort for the kids in knowing that, Wednesday is always choral reading. So they know what's coming up and they felt very comfortable with that.
sure.
So it's something to think about, keeping that routine stable for some of your students is actually going to be motivating for them.
Hmm, I like that. So tell me, when your teachers are thinking about, okay, I like this idea, uh, how do they choose text? Like, how do they choose the actual text to do this kind of fluency work?
Yeah. Well, it's important. I think the most important thing about doing fluency instruction is that the text should be somewhat challenging for all of your students because you're spending a lot of time on it. And what we found is that students who are working with texts that they're already fluent with, they are not going to make great gains, at
Nice.
least in terms of fluency. Now, if you're reading about a new topic, so we just recently did an intervention where we used social studies and history texts. They were all trade books, and the topics were for the most part new for the students. So, for example, we use books on the Statue of Liberty. So, although the text in terms of word recognition might have not have been so challenging for some of the students, the topic was new for them. So they were learning new vocabulary and new concepts, and that kept it fresh for those students.
Mm.
So when you're picking your text, you want to think about picking texts that are challenging in some way for your students. So either new topics, new vocabulary, or with your students who are less fluent than, if you think about that range in your classroom, you have the students who are having trouble with their word recognition automaticity, and you have students who are having less trouble with that, but you're presenting a new topic, there's challenge in multiple ways for those students.
So what kinds of books? Like, so we know we've got decodables in our in our midst now as we're thinking about phonics, learning phonics. We've got level texts. What kind of books should teachers be looking for?
Um, I think if you go back to the Common Core state standards, there's two things that they're asking teachers to do that probably are still, even though they've been around for a while now, they're still relatively new in the grand scheme of things. So that is that they want half of the text to be informational texts.
Hmm.
So those are going to be challenging again for many of your students. And they want you to use material that is at a higher lexile level than had been previously used.
Sure.
So the challenge there is higher as well. So there's a very good chance that for many of your students, the books that you're using in your literature anthology now are more challenging than they used to be. So if you think about using those books for your students, you're going to be able to make good use of that. Now, if you've been using level texts, there are probably between you and the rest of the second or third grade teachers, you probably will be able to pull together enough books that you can create a class set. So you can use multiple texts that way. Also, if you're using trade books, if you go onto Amazon or you go on to, I cannot remember the name, but I will try to get it and we can add it as a website later. But the Lexile website also has the Lexile levels for many different texts. So you can find the Lexile levels and make sure you're in that sweet spot. The other thing is, if you find students, most of your students are relatively fluent with those literature anthology selections or your primary leveled reader for the week, you can go and you can use those other texts, shorten that to the 3-day program, and echo read or choral read other texts on the same subject. You can find that, or even other texts that are not connected to the same subject, because a lot of the words when you're in second and third grade are going to be repeated in multiple texts.
Hmm. So I think you're referring to Metametrics, right,
Right,
Melanie?
Metamet. Thank you so much.
That's okay, no worries. So I really like that idea, but how do you, obviously teachers only have a certain amount of time during the day. How do you involve families in helping children to build their fluency skills, to be more accurate readers, to be able to read with prosody and at a good rate? How
That's
do
a great question. And I think, we know when we send books home, many students, or even when you assign that 20 minutes or 30 minutes of independent reading in the evening, a lot of students will do that, but some students, because of the craziness in our lives these days, they just don't have the time. The parents or the caregivers just don't have the time to sit down with their children and do that reading. So it's really important to tell your kids that they can read those books. They can read them out loud to themselves. They can read them to a younger sibling. They can read them to an older sibling. They can read it to a pet. They can read it to whoever's. We've had students who've read to stuffed animals.
Yeah,
So as long as they're doing that reading, they're benefiting from it. Now, clearly it's better if, you have a person who's a more skilled reader providing that immediate support and feedback. But since you've gone over that text with your children in your classroom, when those children bring those books home, they have a decent chance of getting through those texts on their own.
sure. And I other ideas like come to mind for me, like reading to a plant, like you said, reading to something that's,
Yeah.
I think that's going to help the plant grow. But
Oh my
even
goodness, they've done studies where they've had these kids in one school. I just saw a video about the one plant was getting constantly negative messages and another plant was getting constant positive messages, and the plant with the positive messages was growing and the plant with the negative messages was actually turning brown and dying. So, you can read, if you have that opportunity to read to a plant, that plant's going to thrive.
that's awesome. And so will the student reading, right? Because they're
And
getting
so
all
will the
this
student
great
reading. So it's
practice.
a win-win.
Oh wow, I want to see that article for sure. But if a family member or teacher also wants to really hear that student, or even if the student wants to hear themselves, it might not hurt to have them take their phone or some recording device, because now the computers have a lot of recording device. You can certainly record yourself reading and then listening to that. That also can help build fluency, I think.
Oh, absolutely. That's such a great idea. And it reminds me of all the texts that are available on YouTube now. So the other day I wanted to show my undergraduate students Make Way for Ducklings, and I could get the entire text read to, and the students could see it being read. So your little ones or your students, your elementary students, can absolutely find material online being read expressively, and they can not just listen to, but read along with
Yes.
those stories. And that's going to absolutely help them with their reading growth.
And what do you think the impact of that exercise specifically? How will that support students who are multilingual learners?
Oh my gosh. The having all that access to vocabulary and conceptual knowledge in English is going to be wonderful. And the picture supports that are there. We talk a lot about, and I agree that absolutely I would not point to a picture and ask a child to figure out the word based on the picture. But the picture supports from a book like Make Way for Duckling are going to help students who are ELs make that transition. It supports their understanding of what's happening in the story, and it's a wonderful way of expanding their English learning.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And when we're thinking about fluency, you cannot help but also consider what a fluent child is doing in terms of building knowledge, right? So you mentioned all of these wonderful texts. It might be a line that they could read or reread. But how exactly do fluency and knowledge building kind of go hand in hand?
I think it's so important because our students need to build their reading stamina, and the best way they can do that is through reading. Linda Gambrell did a study many years ago where students were reading, I think it was 6 minutes a day total in the classroom. And Freddie Hebert and Devin Brenner did a study on the same topic more recently with third graders, and they still are not reading much more than 9 minutes a day. We want our students to spend time actually engaged with text, and that's what helps them become fluent readers. And the beauty of reading multiple texts on various topics, whether they're social studies topics or science topics or literature topics, your traditional ELA topics, your language arts topics, you can help students be exposed to vocabulary in multiple text. You can help them be exposed to new content in multiple text. And the idea of what Edie Hirsch said about we're learning about words and worlds so that we aren't reading. He says we aren't reading about nothing. We're always reading about something. And the more different things we read about, the more we have a knowledge base for that. And the work right now on conceptual knowledge and building background knowledge, not assuming that the students have the background knowledge, but actually building that background knowledge, not only comes from you reading to them, but from them reading multiple texts on a topic themselves.
Wow, I love that. Words and worlds. I love that idea. And this concept of we're not just ever reading for the sake of reading. We're always reading to learn, to know something, right? So I think that is a really great takeaway. Now, if you, as we close, if you could provide kind of one thing to leave with our teachers, our families, our school leaders about fluency, what would it be?
That's a really good question. I think the most important thing is that we give our students more opportunity to actually do the reading. And I'm not talking about just handing students a text, because you can do that with their instructional level material, and absolutely they'll be able to read it on their own. But if you want to stretch them and make sure that they're continuing to develop, having that opportunity to read along with or read back to a more skilled reader, having that scaffolding, that support, that's the difference that helps students actually become fluent. I think that's the key there.
Wow, I love it. So more practice, more opportunities to actually do the reading, more than the 6 or 9 minutes that you
Oh
mentioned
gosh,
in the
yes.
study, for sure. Absolutely. I think one of the best advices that I got from a mentor of mine, the person doing the learning is the person doing the talking, is the person doing the writing, and the person doing the reading. So more of that, please.
Yes, absolutely. And
Yeah.
that's such a great way to think about it, that we're providing them with access to all this that is new for them.
Yeah.
And for them to get good at it, they have to do the work.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
really is a beautiful way of thinking about it.
Awesome. Well, Melanie, I have enjoyed talking with you. I appreciate all the work that you're doing to support students, teachers, and families.
Thank you so much. And I really enjoyed our conversation.